Hello again, and welcome back to 5-Minute Bibliography from Pequot Library. I am your host, Dr. Jamie Cumby. I am Pequot's Special Collections Librarian, and this week, as promised, we're going to talk about paper. So the paper that we're talking about looks a lot different and feels a lot different from the paper that we're used to writing on and reading books on. And that's because early modern paper, the kind of paper that we see also in manuscript production and in early printed books, was made using rags, not wood pulp or any kind of plant material. Well, I guess it's plant material because it's cotton, but you get what I mean. It's made using cotton or linen rags. A person literally called a rag picker would take rags from an urbanized area and sell them to the paper mills where they would be processed. And as a treat for you guys, I'm going to share a video that I shot at a functioning 15th century paper mill, Richard de Bas, which is in Ambert in the Auvergne region of France. And that's where a lot of the, really most of the paper that was used to print books in Lyon came from. And that's where I worked on my PhD thesis. So this was a real treat for me, and I hope it'll be a treat for you. And after we talk about and see how early paper was physically made, how these rags turned into something you could write and print on, we'll dive back in and I'll show you some cool pieces of early paper. Okay, so here we are looking at the wheel that powers the mill at Richard de Bas. So if you think about it, all paper production requires water power in order to function in the early world. So that creates interesting conditions for where paper mills can and cannot exist. They have to be close enough to urbanized areas to provide the rags that make the paper, but they also need to be in an area where water power exists. So they have to be in a hilly or mountainous region, and it has to be damp enough for there to be streams that can power mills like this. Now we're going into the room where the magic happens. So here, the paper pulp, which all these rags have been sitting in vats for a couple weeks before this point. They're usually sitting in these vats with chemicals, usually actually urine, which starts the process of breaking down the rags into paper pulp. And now we're seeing the physical process of the rags being broken down. So you see this kind of what looks like a log just sort of turning there. That's being powered by the mill. And you see there are kind of cogs on that log, and that's what is making those mallets go up and down. And the mashing motion of the mallets is what is breaking down further the fibers from these rags into something that can be used with added water to make paper. And this process will go on for a few hours or days until it's time to transfer that into the paper making vat, and the vat man will turn it into paper. We've seen a little bit about what the inside of a paper mill looks like. Before we hit the next step, which is showing you the vat man working and turning that paper pulp slurry into sheets, we'll talk a little bit about where paper comes from. So the earliest ever recorded reports of paper made in this style using molds comes from China some 2,000 years ago. The exact date is lost to time. The first recorded date of a report of paper being used in official Chinese records is from about 150 AD, but again, that's just the first official time. Paper had been made in China before that. And from China, it travels along the Silk Road into the Arab world, where it becomes very important and popular in bureaucratic infrastructure, in writing, in learning and teaching, because paper is relatively cheap to make, especially if we think about it compared with parchment. A single sheet of parchment is a single animal. That's a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of resources. Paper really changes the game when we're talking about writing materials. So from the Arab world, that is how paper reaches Europe. And the date for when paper is first made in Europe is a little bit contested. Reports seem to suggest that it was absolutely being made in Arab Spain before the Reconquista. But outside of that it looks like sometime for the middle of the 13th century, for when paper production in the European world outside of the Arab-controlled parts of Spain, that's really when it starts. And again, that date itself is contested and complicated, but we have paper that dates from the mid-13th century. So now that we've got a little bit of historical context, we'll dive right back in, and I just wanted to show you, before I share my second video from Richard de Bas, this is what the vat man that you'll see is using. This is what a paper mold looks like, and you'll see these early molds are made using two pieces. You see that frame here, so that's the frame, and the decal, and it covers this network of copper wires, and you can't see very well here, but I'm sure you guys are familiar with the term watermark, and watermark is a term, that we see it on like Getty Images things. Watermarks in terms of early paper are literally marks made by the water of the paper pulp that is used to make paper. And it's because in the copper mold that you see here, there's a little design added in addition to the lines, the chain lines, as we call them as bibliographers. And that creates the sort of brand image of the paper mill. And I'll show you here with a piece of paper from Richard de Bas. This is very scientific. I'm doing this without a fancy light sheet. I'm just using the flashlight function on my phone. And what you should be able to see here, you see how the paper looks different right there in the corner? That is the name of the mill that's been twisted with copper wire. And then it also has this very handsome, here we go. I don't know if you can see that there. There we go. You see that little heart mark? That has been the traditional mark of paper makers at Richard de Bas for more than 500 years now. And that's how the paper maker would identify his work. Okay, so now we're back in France, and we're about to see the vat man, who's this burly gentleman here, and he is plunging the form into the paper pulp, and he's just tipping it ever so slightly so that the paper pulp is distributed evenly, and then he's going to remove the decal, like that. Okay, so the last step of this process, which unfortunately I don't have a video of, is called couching. And that is where the vat man is going to let some of the water drain off of the mold, and then in this sort of rocking motion, couches or lies down that burgeoning sheet of paper onto a bed of felt. And the way that you then process the sheets and dry them out is you have them in a press where you've interleaved new sheets and sheets of felt, and then you turn the crank of the press and that gets all the water out, and then you've got your sheets that you can hang up to dry. And that's how you make paper in the early modern world, and also the medieval world, as we discussed. So I hope you had fun with this week's video about paper, and I hope you'll tune in next week when we talk about how you turn all that paper into a book, when we talk about format.